shortly after arriving in the land where he will live as a captive and a foreigner virtually all of his life was in danger. And God was faithful, and his life and the lives of his companions were spared. He served faithfully and with integrity where God had placed him. And as a result, the kings he served prospered. And because they prospered, he prospered just as God had promised through the prophet Jeremiah. He was elevated to high positions of responsibility and honor. Even though he has prospered, his life has not been easy. He has not been free. He has been a captive. Not only that, he and his people are hated by the other nations who are under these kings' rule. And yet, he served those who held him captive in such a way that he honored God, and so did his companions. For more than 60 years, he has lived a life that honors God because he knows that God is God and that he is faithful. Through it all, there has been a longing for home. That longing for home is evident in that 3 times a day, every day, he would get down on his knees and pray, facing Jerusalem. Even when doing so meant he might possibly die. We looked at that event in Daniel's life the past 2 weeks. But there's one more thing I want to look at in chapter 6 before we move on in our study of the book of Daniel. And I find it interesting that we just happen to be looking at Daniel chapter 6 at this point in time, and especially today. I mean, so, what is it? I mean, he's a captive. We've looked at that. He's a foreigner. We've looked at that too. Many are jealous of him and the prosperity he has had by serving faithfully, and we've looked at that. And he's hated by many. And the only ones who seem to want him around are the kings who he has served, and they didn't even seem to always want him around. Nevertheless, if you would, Daniel prayed faithfully 3 times a day. And this is an interesting thing that we find here at this juncture in the book of Daniel, because Daniel chapter 6 is the transition point where we move from narrative to prophecy. This is the point where everything changes as far as the flow of the book of Daniel. And in this passage we saw that Daniel got on his knees 3 times a day, every day, praying. But what was at the heart of his prayers? Well, let's look at that one verse in Daniel again that we've looked at a few times, and that is, if you would, now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to God, just as he had done before. Consider that. That one verse squeezed there just shy of being in the middle of the chapter gives us volumes of information about Daniel's life. You see, in spite of the fact that he is a captive and has been relocated over 1,000 miles away from his home, in spite of the fact that he has been castrated and will never have a family, in spite of the fact that he will never see his homeland again, in spite of the fact that the Babylonians tried to make him a Babylonian, in spite of the fact that the Babylonians tried to re-educate him and make him a pagan, and in spite of the fact that he is hated and people are trying to have him killed, and it seems as though they are going to succeed at the beginning part of this chapter, in spite of the fact he's suffering the consequences of the actions of others, instead of crying out to God and saying, "Woe is me," 3 times a day, every day of his life, if you would, Daniel gets on his knees facing Jerusalem and gives thanks to God. He doesn't ask God to have a pity party for him. He doesn't complain about his situation. He doesn't even blame God for what's going on. I mean, think about it. In today's day and age, what happens so much of the time when things aren't quite right? We blame God. But we begin to understand what Daniel understood, and that was the fact that he was not in any position to blame God. It was the Jews' fault they were there, not God's fault. God had warned them time and time again. And it finally reached the point where God basically said, well, if that's the way you want it, okay, I told you this was coming. And in spite of all of that, he gives thanks. As we began to look at this chapter, we understood that we were looking at a life lived to honor God. Throughout this entire chapter, this was the culmination of everything of the narrative section of the book of Daniel, where we see that Daniel has continued to honor God, and God has been faithful and preserving his people, and Daniel's presence, even after everything that had gone on, gave us that reassurance that God is faithful, because God is God. We had looked at the fact that kingdoms have risen, kingdoms had fallen, kings had come and gone, and yet the one name that remained was Daniel. And his presence symbolic of God's faithfulness. I mean, try and imagine ourselves being in that type of a situation. Captive, never going to see your homeland again, having to serve foreign kings. I mean, let's face it. I mean, we're really good at grumbling and complaining, aren't we? We're really good at that. Matter of fact, I would say that for the most part, people in the United States of America have become masters of grumbling and complaining. I wonder if maybe it's because we've had things too good for too long. Masters of grumbling and complaining. Then the Thanksgiving season comes around, and then we tell ourselves that we need to shift our focus and start being thankful for 30 days. Right? Kind of think about it. I mean, I saw a meme just a couple of days ago out online. You know, people spend 11 months out of the year complaining about everything on Facebook, and then all of a sudden for 30 days they'll be thankful memes. You know? But there's something we need to understand that we find in the life of Daniel. And that is, if you would, we cannot live a life that honors God if we are not living a life of thankfulness. Can't do it. That is essential to honoring God, is living a life of thankfulness. But gratitude seems to be something that isn't readily embraced except at Thanksgiving time for some reason. No, don't get me wrong. I mean, we do thank people for the things they do and when they help us and so on. And, you know, basically what we're doing is we're exercising what we call manners. You know, it's the polite thing to do. But that's not really an attitude of gratitude and thankfulness. That's just a responsibility to be polite and show the proper manners. And so we say please and thank you, and we go through the motions. But actually living with a heart of gratitude, I mean, all we have to do is look around, and we see the evidence that, for the most part, it's not there. Everything is so self-centered. Everything is about meeting my expectations, and everything is about me being the I concept. I want this. I want things this way. Me, 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 me. I mean, we sang the song, Count Your Blessings. But how often do we actually do that? Oh, I know a lot of families have the tradition that when you gather at the Thanksgiving table, before anybody eats, you go around and you name something you're thankful for. One day a year. But how often do we actually take time to consider our blessings throughout the year? I mean, we're real good about going to God when we have something troubling us, aren't we? I mean, pray for this. So-and-so's having this problem. I'm struggling with this. Pray, 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 pray. But I would venture to say today that most Christians rarely go to God just to thank Him for His blessings. Blessings, mind you, that we don't even deserve. God, throughout the daily of our lives, continues to pour out blessings on us over and over again. And yet, most of the time, we rarely ever stop to consider those blessings. Sometimes I think we perhaps even miss the fact that there are so many blessings that we don't even see, don't even recognize, because we've become so accustomed to the way things are. I mean, it's just become normal that we have a roof over our heads. It's normal that we've got clothes to wear, shoes on our feet, food on our table. I mean, that's normal, isn't it? There's a lot of people that would beg to differ. And not just in third world countries. Even among us today, in this nation of great affluence, there are those who would cherish what we consider to be normal. I think that's one of the reasons the Apostle Paul wrote in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, if you would, "Rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus." I want you to understand something. The way that passage reads with those commas in there, basically what he's doing is tying all three of those things to "in all circumstances." In other words, what he's saying is, rejoice always in all circumstances, pray continually in all circumstances, give thanks in all circumstances. And we have a tendency to forget how those three are all interconnected and so important that one leads to the next, that it's all part of one process. And one of the things that we struggle with, and let's face it, is we have a real hard time rejoicing in all circumstances, don't we? I mean, we tend to be just the opposite of Daniel. I mean, for the most part, a lot of the people I know, if they were to be in Daniel's position, they'd be going around, "Woe is me. Lord, can't you fix this situation? Can't you speed things up a little bit? Hey, I've been one of the good guys. I was faithful to you through everything. Why me?" He was suffering the consequences of someone else's actions. I mean, most everybody that I come into contact with, especially outside the church, would be grumbling, complaining. "This isn't right, God. Why?" But instead, we're told to give thanks in all circumstances, not just the good ones. One might think, what has Daniel got to be thankful for? I mean, think about it. God has turned his life upside down. I mean, from what we see in the way he lived his life in Babylon, it's pretty safe to gather from that information that before Judah fell to the Babylonians, Daniel was probably among the remnant that was still faithful. He wasn't engaged in idolatry. He wasn't involving himself in all of these things that were angering God. But yet, even though he was, a good boy, so to speak, a good young man, faithful to God, you might say he got caught in the crossfire. And God turned his life upside down, and his companions, just like he did with the rest of the Jews, and sent him into a pagan land to live. Try and wrap your mind around that. I mean, that's kind of one of the things that we're struggling with in this country right now. We're watching as this country becomes more and more pagan. Okay? And I say pagan and not atheist. And I say that because there is such a rise in the occult interest and the spiritual things, but they're not following after God. They're going everywhere else chasing after it. We are becoming a pagan nation. And so in many ways, we are finding ourselves in the same situation where even without leaving our land, we've been sent into exile into a pagan nation. So God has turned his life upside down, sent him into a pagan land to live, taken away any hope of him having a family or seeing his homeland again. He has had to serve pagan kings in order to survive and prosper. And he has had to serve those kings in a way that honors God while they were trying to turn him into a pagan Babylonian. Talk about stuck in the middle. And at times, honoring God in the way he served endangered his life. I mean, if you really understand the flow of the first 6 chapters of Daniel, you begin to realize he has been constantly having to be looking over his shoulder because there was always someone who would stab him in the back, literally, if not figuratively. There was always someone looking to bring him down. There was always someone looking to get him in trouble. And to those who don't live a life of thankfulness, it doesn't make sense to them that he would be thankful. To them, the question still lingers, if you would, what does Daniel have to be thankful for? You know who they are. You know, I mean, they're the ones who seem to always look to find fault with something or someone. Always looking for something to be wrong. Always looking for something to point their finger at. The ones who can't seem to find anything good in those around them or in the circumstances around them. The ones who always seem to be wanting a pity party. Always complaining about something. Nothing is ever right or good enough. So to them, there's no reason to be thankful. Because to them, everything looks like, well, it's just yuck. Life is just yuck. But to those who live a life of thankfulness, they're the type of people who believe there is always something good that can be found in every situation, and they look for it. You ever notice how people seem to be drawn to them like a magnet? Because they seem to always be looking for the good in others. They're amazing people. I mean, they're the ones that, you know, you might find yourself occasionally caught up in the gossip a little bit, and you're like, well, yes, so and so, and they'll say, yeah, but, and somehow they're able to find something good. To them, the saying that there is a silver lining to every cloud is true. I mean, does that mean if you have a situation you're in and you can't seem to find any good in it, that you're not thankful? No, not at all. Sometimes it's very difficult to find the good. I mean, like I said, we all know people like that who are always looking to find the good, and I've talked to several of them, and they admit sometimes it's hard to find the good. Very difficult. And then there are times that the good isn't recognized until long after the situation's been resolved. Looking back, you know, that other saying, hindsight is 20/20. Able to look back after everything has seemed to come apart and begin to realize, you know, there was something good there. But I was so caught up in all the negative stuff going on, I missed the glimmer of hope. I missed the sunrise because I was too busy looking at the storm. There's a wonderful promise we find in Romans chapter 8, if you would. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. What an awesome promise that is. No matter what is going on in the lives of the faithful, if you will, God will bring something good from it. It may not be immediately. It may not be in the middle of what's going on. It might be a situation where we look back some maybe weeks, years later and see what was going on. Because we need to understand something, that regardless of what is going on in our lives, we don't see the big picture. Only God sees it. There are things that we will not see and recognize until sometime on down the road. And sometimes we may not even recognize it in this life. But we need to understand something. God is always working for the good of His people. And even in the bad times, we need to be thankful, because we understand from the promises of God's Word that He is striving to bring good from everything going on in our lives. Even when it doesn't seem like it at the time. And so when we find ourselves in those situations that are so tough, that are heart-wrenching, we need to be thankful. Because if you would, God will bring something good from it. Because He sees the bigger picture. We might not see it right away. And it might seem impossible. It might be in the midst of things we look around and we say to ourselves, it's absolutely impossible for anything good to come from this. But there's something we need to remember. If you would. Our God is faithful, and He specializes in making the impossible possible. Several times when Jesus walked this earth, He basically said, you may think it's impossible, but with God it's not. In the Old Testament, God said through the prophet, is anything too difficult for me? So as we've looked through these first 6 chapters of Daniel, and we begin to look beneath the situations he has found himself in, there were so many things that Daniel had to be thankful for in spite of his situation. I'd say at the top of the list was the fact, if you would, he was alive. I mean, his life was in danger at least twice before the events that led him to being thrown into the den of lions. I mean, we look at the Scriptures, and the first thing we pull out of there is, well, he was in danger twice. No, actually 3 times total if you look at what the Scriptures have to say. Yes, the first time when Nebuchadnezzar had the dream and he was going to kill off all the magicians and astrologers and everybody that was being taught by them and everything, and Daniel was caught in that, and God got him out of that situation. He was faithful and true. And yeah, we're familiar with the situation where he was thrown in the den of lions. You might be scratching your head and saying, well, where's the third one? I don't remember seeing the third one in there. Well, it's because we forget to look at the culture of the day when we see something happen at the end of chapter 5. Remember, at the end of chapter 5, what has taken place is we've had the writing on the wall. And Belshazzar is terrified. No one can interpret what it is or even read it. So finally the queen says, oh, there's this guy that Nebuchadnezzar always put in charge of things. His name is Daniel. He can handle this. Daniel is brought in, reads the writing, interprets it, tells Belshazzar what it means. And basically what it comes down to is, Belshazzar, it's over tonight. And in response, Belshazzar keeps his oath that whoever reads it and interprets it will have a gold chain put around his neck. He will be elevated to 3rd in the kingdom. And what happens that night? Babylon falls to the Medes and the Persians. What happens when a new regime comes in to anybody in government? That's right. Interesting. Daniel has just been elevated to the 3rd highest ranking official in the kingdom. The Medes and the Persians come in. They're killing off all the government officials except for one, Daniel. That's the 3rd time his life was in danger, at the transition of kingdoms. And so thankful? Well, he was alive. What else did he have to be thankful for? Well, he was well fed. That's one thing that we did see from the Scriptures, and that is that those that the kings elevated into these positions, they had basically everything they needed. They were well fed. As a matter of fact, if you remember in the first chapter, they were so well fed with things that were offered to idols and prepared improperly that Daniel and his companions basically said, well, just give us vegetables. King sends in a feast. So they were well fed. Also, we understand from what's transpired in chapter 6, he's got a roof over his head. He's got his own place. And it's laid out perfectly because he's got that window that faces Jerusalem so that he can pray facing Jerusalem, just as Solomon had instructed should happen when they were taken into captivity. And the other thing we see is the kings he served treated him well. He's been well treated by the kings. I mean, they've honored him, they've promoted him. Even Darius in chapter 6 is upset because he had to follow through on the edict that he was tricked into issuing. So he's been treated very well by the kings. Also, if you would, he and his people were being preserved, and they were prospering and multiplying just as God had promised. Remember what we read in Jeremiah. God said, look to the welfare of the place where you are going, because if they prosper, you will prosper. I want you to multiply there. I don't want you to die out, because I'm going to bring you back. And when it comes time, I want a whole new generation that's ready to come back to the land that I've given you. So see to the welfare of the place where you are going so that you will prosper as they prosper. Because that meant when the time came for them to return to their homeland, there would be a whole new generation to be led out of captivity. I don't know if you've thought about this. In many ways, what we're looking at is that the time was near for there to be a second Exodus. I don't know if you ever thought about that. I mean, we focus in on the idea that God's people were led out of bondage from Egypt, and we call it the Exodus. And yet, that's also what's going to happen later on as they are led out of bondage under the Medes and the Persians. Another Exodus. Returning to the homeland, the promised land. A second Exodus. So, not only has Daniel prospered, if you would, Daniel has been promoted to high levels of responsibility within the governments of both kingdoms in which he has been under. Been elevated, been promoted, been put in charge of things. That's pretty impressive for a captive. But that's what happens when one has lived a life honoring God, which is a life filled with thankfulness and gratitude for what you've been given. And even though the Jews were sent into exile to discipline them, if you would, God has been faithful and has not abandoned them. I mean, that was one of the first things that we looked at, the fact that when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem and Judah fell, that one of the first things that would have been on their mind is that God's abandoned us. Our God has been defeated. He's abandoned us. Is He really God? And yet throughout the narrative of Daniel, we see that God has been faithful and He has not abandoned His people. He has been faithful and true. He's been watching out for them. He's been caring for them because He intends to bring them back. So, 3 times a day, every day of his life, Daniel opens the window that faces Jerusalem, gets down on his knees, and if you would, gives God thanks. In a situation that we would struggle to find reason to be thankful for, Daniel gives God thanks. We too have so much to be thankful for. Our lives, our families, our income, roof over our head, food on our table. Beyond all of that, God sent His Son to die for us so that our sins would be forgiven. And the truth is, if that was all He ever did, was send His Son to die for us, it would be enough to demand we live lives of thankfulness. And yet, He has blessed us with so much more. Too often we forget about our blessings. We're quick to run to Him in times of trouble. But very rarely do we pause and just simply thank Him for the blessings He gives us each and every day. We get so caught up in the rat race of this world and distracted by its difficulties that, if you would, we miss the good things that God is doing in our lives. I mean, while God has never promised that life would be a bed of roses, He did promise that He would bring good out of the bad things that happen in the lives of His children. He did promise that He would be faithful and that He would carry us through. He did promise that He would be with us through the bad times. And He promised, if you would, never to leave us or forsake us. And yet, we struggle to give thanks except for a few days out of the year. So quick to take our problems to God. So slow to thank Him for the good things He's done. What about you? If you would, when was the last time you thought about all of the blessings God has given you? And not only thought about them, paused and took time out of your day to say thank you. I'm convinced that the more time we spend counting our blessings, the less time we'll spend being concerned about everything going on around us. I think Satan is real good at getting us distracted by throwing all the bad things at us in an effort to get us to miss the good things. Satan's real good at getting us to not be thankful. So I would suggest the next time you find yourself in a situation that you're struggling with, maybe ask yourself, what good blessing is it Satan was trying to get me not to see? What is it that I'm missing that God wants me to see? I think if we really want to honor God with our lives the way Daniel honored God, it's important that we live a life of thankfulness, which includes rejoicing always and praying continually, regardless of the circumstances we are in. And where does that all begin? Well, living a life of thankfulness begins by, if you would, offering ourselves to God as living sacrifices, giving ourselves to Him completely. Let me ask you this. Is your all on the altar? Or are you one of those living sacrifices that maybe slipped off the altar and run off to the side somewhere? I would suggest that one of the things that would help our communities, our families, our churches, our own lives, we get ourselves back up on the altar. Offer ourselves completely to God. And like Daniel, live a life of thankfulness that honors God. Are you prepared to be an offering? Are you prepared to get on that altar as a living sacrifice and give your all to Him? Would you do that today?